Today, we are here at the George Mackey Library in Delta, launching The Ray of Hope, a book by the good doctor who had lost his entire family in Canada. And after that, to deal with that issue, which is humongous for anyone and tragic, he actually went back to India, returned to India, took all of his belongings and all of his assets, and set up a school for children and to educate the children. And I understand that, out of a very, very tragic and a difficult situation, he's built a life for himself, a purpose for himself, as well as obviously he's making the children's lives that he educates obviously wonderful. And I had an opportunity to see him at the Vancouver East Cultural Center many, many years ago when there was a documentary that was made on his life. It was screened, and I hold him in the highest esteem. I admire people who can turn such tragedy into such triumph for the world. Well, we every year deal with the tragedy of Air India, and we gather at the memorial to pay tribute to the victims and admire the families that have made a life for themselves after such a huge tragedy. We also go there to remind the police to continue the investigation. As well, we try and make sure that we continue to pursue some closure for the families that have been left behind. But there has been a certain section in the politics and the society of this country that has been in constant denial about the Air India. Some of them are truthers or near truthers who think somebody else did it. But there is so much evidence that Mr. Parmar was the brainchild. It was Mr. Parmar's brainchild. He was the mastermind of Air India. Mr. Riyat, who has been convicted of the Narita explosion, he pled guilty to the Air India manslaughter. He confessed to making the bombs for Mr. Parmar. Mr. Parmar, before the Air India explosion, before the Narita explosion, said Indian planes would fall from the skies, and the Air India plane obviously fell. The other plane obviously was damaged, at least the people were killed on the ground at Narita. And then on top of that, we've had the Supreme Court of British Columbia, the judge, the defense, and the prosecutors say that agree that it was Mr. Parmar who masterminded the Air India disaster. We've had the judicial inquiry by Mr. Justice Major. That also concluded that it was Mr. Parmar that led the conspiracy to bomb Air India and cause the Narita explosion. Despite all of this evidence, this mountain of evidence, there are politicians and there are ordinary people in this country that continue to glorify the murderer, Talwinder Parmar, the terrorist Talwinder Parmar and his associates. There are several dozen people that I know across this country. There are several politicians that I know that glorify this murderer every year at the various parades. They go to the stages where these guys' photos are displayed. They go to stages where there's a cry for dismemberment of India, to separate it into what they want Khalistan out of it. And so, I just want to make sure that on this day, at least we remember that the families of Air India victims haven't had closure. They would only have closure, they could have closure, rather, if the politicians and other people in this country stopped portraying the likes of Parmar as martyrs and glorifying them. And obviously, they would have closure if the police could continue to work and perhaps bring charges, new charges against the old people or new charges against new people. We need closure. It is very difficult for the families, at least, to continue to do this year after year after year without the hope of closure. Thank you.
The issue of Air India is extremely complicated as it relates to Canada. We had over 280 Canadians were on the plane, including 86 children that were under the age of 12. This was a Canadian tragedy, and it wasn't seen that way when it first occurred. We had the Foreign Affairs Minister, Joe Clark, expressing condolences to Rajiv Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister of India, when in fact you could make the case that people should have been sending condolences to the government of Canada for the loss of all these Canadians and the loss of so much future potential for Canada. It was such a tragedy when you think of those children, what they might have become in Canada and the losses that the families endured. What impresses me about this book, Chandra Sankarathri, he went back to his wife's village. He lost his wife and his two children in the bombing on June 23rd, 1985. And he decided to set up a charity. He took something terribly negative and tried to make something positive out of it. What he did was he created a school in the name of his daughter and a hospital in the name of his son. And the hospital started performing cataract surgeries and has done actually over 200,000 surgeries by 2014 to help the people of India. And to me, this is one of the most incredible stories I've ever seen. I've been in journalism for over 30 years in Vancouver, and to watch this and see this, one of the things that I also find intriguing about this is, in a way, it's kind of an expression of what you might read in the Bhagavad Gita as it relates to attachment. And the Gita says there are many references to attachment, that we shouldn't become selfishly attached. We shouldn't become selfishly attached to things, to wealth, to positions, to prestige. And I think what he has done has demonstrated this in action. This kind of unattachment is a reflection of you can actually look at things in a much more logical way when you're not overly attached. And instead of simply wallowing in grief, he hasn't forgotten his children. That's clear. He's clearly devastated by his loss. But he's still managed to turn this thing into something positive. And I think there are spiritual lessons in that for all of us.